We are so happy to have you, whether you are getting through a meal, just having a cup of coffee, or fasting for Ramadan. Welcome to all of you. I'm Kate Goodall. If you haven't met me, I'm co-founder and CEO of Halcyon, and we started this weekly series to add Halcyon Fellows' voices to everything that's out there right now, because we always find their perspective so informed, honest, and uplifting. For those of you that are new to this, Halcyon is a nonprofit based in DC, and we supercharge the best social entrepreneurs and civic-minded artists with extraordinary world-changing ideas. The biggest way we do that is through fellowships, where we provide a combination of housing, work, and studio space, mentorship, stipends, and other resources. Obviously, that's a little stymied right now, but we do still have fellows in residence. If you are not sure, just a couple of logistical things, where the chat is at the bottom of your screen, just familiarize yourself with the rows of icons, one of which says chat. This is where you can send messages during the event. And along that bottom row, you can also find stuff like participants button, which you can also use later for Q&A. And if you run into any problem, just post in the chat and a Halcyon team member will respond to you. On another very quick note, if any of our speakers mention websites and other resources, we'll be keeping a list of those in the chat bar, but also in the post-event email. So if you miss anything, don't worry, just keep an eye out for that tomorrow. All right, with all of that out of the way, we're ready to dive in. Today, I am joined by three wonderful Halcyon Fellows who all work with a demographic that is traditionally underpaid, under-resourced, and undervalued. They all work to provide jobs and opportunities to immigrants and refugees. As we all know, the voiceless populations always get hit hardest in times of crisis, and this time of COVID is no different. We have seen many support and resettlement efforts grind to a halt, access to healthcare becoming harder, and immigration bans in many countries, including the US. So their challenging work just became even more important. I'm going to hand off the virtual mic to each of them in turn to introduce themselves, and I'll just ask everyone else to make sure you're muted as we go around. Let's start with you, Aileen. Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Good morning, everyone. I'm lucky I have a couple more hours I've been awake for as I'm in Paris. So thanks for joining us so early. So my name is Aline, and I am the co-founder and CEO of Natakallam, which means we speak in Arabic. And our goal is to provide income to refugees wherever they are, regardless of their work status, by leveraging the gig economy and their native language skills. And we hire them as online tutors, teachers, and translators. So Kate, did you want me to go a bit more in depth, or just now the very quick intros?
No, definitely to talk about Natakallam, why it was set up, and you know, what's the main problem it's aiming to solve and how it works.
Sure. So my background is mostly in human rights and journalism, and my parents are from Lebanon. They moved to the US at the height of the Lebanese Civil War. And they are an example of immigrants and what it means when immigrants can safely come to this country. And so today I consider both the US and Lebanon my home. And I spent quite a few years in Lebanon where I was a journalist, and that was right at the time of the Arab uprisings, which we all know. We saw the Syrian conflict pick up then, and that triggered the worst refugee crisis since World War II. And I know that we talk about refugees, and we tend to talk about them as this big kind of monolithic group, but it's a very nuanced and complex word with all types of profiles. And I know that we talk about the crisis, but I just, just to give a few numbers, Lebanon is a country of 4 million, and there are over 1 million Syrians in Lebanon. So I would say that Lebanon has a refugee crisis, not Europe and not the US. And the tragedy in all this is that most refugees, while they may get away from the violence in their homeland, when they cross borders, so Syrians going to Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Venezuelans who are also fleeing dire living circumstances and human rights violations, cross borders to countries where they're often not given a right to work or struggle tremendously to access the workforce. Putting in another number in there, which I think is important, is that 80% of displaced people are in developing countries. So when I was seeing the situation in Lebanon, very concerned both for Lebanon's stability as we had our own 20-year civil conflict, and also concerned for Syrians who cannot access an income and actually only have a 1% chance of being resettled to another country where they're given a right to work. I thought of the gig economy and the fact that we live in a virtual world now more than ever. And the idea was very simple. For anyone who wanted to work on their Arabic, they could connect over Skype and they'd be paired with a Syrian who will teach them Arabic. And so since that idea, Natakallam has grown into a social enterprise that provides online language learning services in Arabic, French, Persian, and Spanish. We also have partnerships with major schools and universities across the country for both language practice and cultural exchange. And we also deliver translation services, which is also another type of work that is leveraging language skills and can be done remotely. So just also to add a few more numbers, the situation for refugees and migration and migrants was already catastrophic before Corona. We were looking at over 70 million people who are forced to flee their homes. And most of these people are stuck in a limbo status, effectively with no clear pathway to a future. With the situation with the virus, we're going to be seeing even more border closures, refugees and migrants being used as scapegoats, accused of bringing in the virus. And it's, basically, as we've all heard, that the already vulnerable in our society are going to be even more vulnerable. Now, to put a little bit of optimism in the conversation, I will share that Natakallam is really lucky to be born an online program. And so as a result, the uplifting news is that over the past 6 weeks, so many people have been at home looking for ways to enrich themselves digitally and through ed tech and online sources. So we've actually seen more than a doubling in the sales of our language classes, which is enabling us to provide a 30% increase in disbursements to our language partners who are scattered around the globe in 25 different countries. So in terms of just general numbers, today we've provided over $750,000 to our language tutors and translators through Natakallam. And luckily we can hope to see this grow even more, given more people are tuned into the digital option for their language services. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Elaine. That's perfect intro. Sarah, can we move to you? Can you describe what it is that Tables Without Borders does?
Sure, thanks, Kate. So Tables Without Borders is a nonprofit organization that helps refugees and asylees rebuild their lives through the power of food. And how we do that is we place refugees and asylees with culinary backgrounds from their home countries to restaurants in their area where they participate in a paid culinary internship program. And this culinary internship culminates in a Tables Without Borders dinner that allows the chef to feature the cuisine from their home country, as well as debut themselves to the community. And at the end of the internship and dinner, Tables Without Borders, along with our local partners, pair these refugees and asylees to job opportunities in the culinary industry. And this model has really helped address the post-resettlement process. So after refugees and asylees come to the US, they're faced with several problems. And the first is that they're unable to find jobs that align with the skill set that they've built for years in their home countries, as well as several economic problems that refugees and asylees face. A few numbers to that problem are, after 5 years of living in the US, 67% of refugees are in low-income households, and 42% of them earn what the median US-born income is. And Tables Without Borders aims to alleviate that problem in small part for the community that comes to the United States looking for opportunities in the culinary industry. We just launched last year, but to date we've been successful in placing over 80% of our chefs in job opportunities in the culinary arts. And we provide the avenue for them to not only gain experience in a US kitchen, but also we provide them with a gateway to opportunities in the culinary industry that they wouldn't otherwise have. So that's kind of in a nutshell what Tables Without Borders does.
Thank you, Sarah. And we'll come back to you. Obviously, you know, your industry's been so affected by the current crisis, and we'll talk a bit more about that. But last but not least, let me introduce the wonderful Erin Janklow. Erin, can you talk a bit about Entrada and your work with immigrants?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Erin. I'm the founder of Entrada. And when I was in my early 20s, I became fluent in Italian, which started during a study abroad program and then continued after I was living in the country. And that experience really made me wonder, how was it so possible for me to go from 0 to 100 in such little time? What resources did I have? And why is it so challenging for immigrants at home and really all around the world to learn the language of their home country as well? That led me to start Entrada. So we're a workforce development program that teaches low-income immigrants and refugees English at the same time that they're working. And I think even more importantly than that, we also look at all of the psychology that goes into teaching adults how to speak a language and how to take risks and really observe when they're making progress and how to set those goals in order to create a path of upward mobility. Studies will show that lack of English limits your earning potential up to 60%. And that's just in comparing two people with the exact same background, one who speaks English and one who doesn't. So it's really a dire but accepted crisis that we see really here for sure and all around the world. So we have spent heaps of time really refining how to integrate this into a workforce solution. So many of these essential workers are immigrants, and in these industries, you know, we're seeing a lot from the industry right now, but prior to COVID, turnover was very high. So we were able to create this program that both helped businesses retain their staff and create better workplace relationships and internally promote their workers, while also giving people a path to become more independent in their workplace and in their communities.
Thank you, Erin. It's very hard for most of us to really understand what life must be like for a refugee or low-wage immigrant. Can each of you provide a small glimpse, perhaps, by sharing a story about someone that you've gotten to know through your work? And we'll go back to the start and start with Aileen and then work back through you, if you don't mind. Aileen, do you mind sharing a small glimpse?
Sure. So I'll travel back to Lebanon, where Natakallam was born. So, you know, an example of what this really looks like, one of our tutors, her name is Noor. She's in her late 20s, and she was a biology teacher, and she was working in Raqqa, which actually became ISIS's capital. So she lived under ISIS and managed to flee, and she got to Lebanon. And in Lebanon, she basically had no rights and no really identity. Because in countries like Lebanon, the influx of refugees is so massive that it's actually very hard to process them, and it's very difficult to even get recognition under the UN and under UNHCR. So basically, she was facing a situation where she has no idea when she'll actually be able to restart a life and access an income. Because what we might not realize is, I mentioned it quickly, but there's things called resettlement, right? So many of the refugees Sarah might be working with were living in camps or were living in these limbo status, like in Lebanon, and they managed to get formally resettled through a global system, very often spearheaded by UNHCR. And that really relies on country policies and their acceptance rates. And just to talk about the US, we were around 100,000 refugee acceptances under Obama. That number has gone down, was split in half at the beginning of Trump's presidency. And I think the last data has been that he's trying to bring it down to 0. And of course, with Corona and everything that's been done around that, it's going to be very hard for refugees to get resettled. So there's actually less than a 1% chance of refugees in these type of situations to get resettled. So we were connected to Noor through different channels and our networks on the ground. And she actually became a language tutor with us. And through one of her students, she was actually put in touch with a local resettlement agency in Italy. And she was able to apply, and we were actually able to vouch for her as well, because it's kind of like when you're applying to a job or school, it's like a networking system, you need extra support. And she was actually able to resettle to Italy. And now she's been still working with us, and she's struggling to access an income. But what's fascinating about NetTech Academy is we can follow our quote unquote beneficiaries wherever they go. And now she's actually gotten an offer at an Italian university to become an Arabic teacher there. So that's kind of a very positive story. But I think, I think my learning experience is that the amount of challenges at every level when you're a refugee, when you don't have a formal identity, and especially when you're from countries that are very demonized, really you're just facing challenges at every step of the way. But we're, she's doing well, and so that's I like to go on the positive stories. So yeah,
Thank you. Sarah, let's jump to you. Can you share a story of one of your chefs?
Sure. So Najat was a chef back in Afghanistan, and Najat is an asylum seeker and came to the US a few years ago. He went from growing up in restaurants to owning his own restaurant at one point in Afghanistan, to coming to the US as an asylum seeker, finding himself in a couple of oddball jobs here in the US, but ended up being a security guard at a local at a building in his neighborhood. But if you ask Najat what his passion is and what he wants to be doing, it's sharing Afghan cuisine and traditional Afghan cuisine with his community, but he hasn't been able to find the right resources to kind of enter into the culinary industry that he's been so passionate about his whole entire life. So Najat applied for a Tables Without Borders internship last year and was fortunate enough to cook at Michelin star restaurant Maidan in Washington, D.C. After cooking at Maidan for one night, his menu items sold out halfway through the night, and all of the guests were really interested in getting a hold of Najat's food and essentially welcomed him into the culinary community here in Washington, D.C. So after participating in our internship, Najat received an offer to continue cooking at the Hilton Hotel in Tyson's Corner and continue perfecting his culinary cuisine, as well as developing other culinary traditions. And this is just a prime example of how an internship in a top-notch restaurant, as well as a network through which Maidan and our local partners are able to provide for a chef like Najat, was able to kind of open up doors for him and allow him to enter into the culinary world and share his traditional cuisine with the community that he wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So that's just a small example of how just providing these opportunities is how Tables Without Borders is able to make an impact in the lives of individuals who want to keep cooking when they resettle to the US.
Erin, can you give us a glimpse into the life of one of your hotel workers?
Yes. I think more than focusing on one worker in this scenario, it's actually a little more helpful to take a higher level view and look at hospitality in general. So most of our initial clients were either hospitality or warehouse staff, essentially those really repetitive roles that are done in isolation that give people the space to also be learning English at the same time. So it's been, this whole journey for me has been a really interesting look at systemic oppression. And I think COVID has really brought that straight into the spotlight. In terms of what's happening, the hospitality was the first to completely just let go of all of its staff. And they're going through a difficult time. Vacancy is almost at 100%. So they don't necessarily need to have employees, but they let them go with no benefits, no safety net at all. So I think that, the two kind of primary things we're hearing from our graduates are this beautiful dichotomy of people are very scared. Many jobs have been lost. I think probably this group is maybe more preaching to the choir, but we work with domestic workers who are no longer invited into people's homes, and everyone was really cut off right at the get-go. It was an easy thing to cut out. And what's really challenging about that is that the way that these systems have been set up is it's no one's responsibility to consider what's happening and how these people are going to be getting access to basic needs and how they're going to be able to continue to pay rent. So I was actually in a conference the other day with many hospitality leaders and was really disheartened to hear the conversation was just like, among leaders who've earned billions of dollars in buybacks. It's not my responsibility. These aren't technically our employees. So if it's not their responsibility as private, then the question I think becomes where is the responsibility? I think it's an unfair ask to expect people who are earning less than minimum wage really to have a safety net that prepares them for this. So it's really important to keep that in mind and to know that the conversations I've been in at the higher levels don't seem particularly fazed, which provides us all on this call and all around the world with immense opportunities. But I think we're going to talk about those in a moment.
Yeah, I appreciate you sort of touching on the current moment in the pandemic and how it's affecting, your work and the people you work with. I'd love, Elaine or Sarah, if you want to jump in and talk specifically about COVID and what it's meant for you.
Yeah, sure. What does COVID mean in the most basic sense of washing hands and social distancing in the refugee space? Well, many refugee camps around the world, it's absolutely impossible to practice social distancing. And even if you're not in a refugee camp, and you probably live multiple people in an apartment, in informal housing, it's very difficult. And washing hands in certain refugee camps is also a luxury because of the very limited resources, even from a water, food, sanitation standpoint. It's really a catastrophe what this means for these populations. Of course, there are refugees at different stages and in different situations, but overall, the repercussions are, that the basic practices that we can do cannot be done by millions of these individuals. And the other, major repercussion is again, I mentioned it in passing, but any refugee who was waiting to get resettled, maybe had got in some way into the resettlement process, their chances of getting resettled are probably now back to complete zero, as if they weren't already very low. It's terrifying to see there's lots of populations who are stuck in between borders. Before Corona happened, there was a huge scandal at the Greek border. The EU, was being questioned for how it's treating the situation there. It's really unimaginable. And people in Greece and in Turkey, from the populations we know, we're really not that different from them. And unfortunately, there's such a depiction of the other. Again, when we think refugee, we think, we don't really think what, someone that could just be like us. But the truth is, there's many refugees who really resemble us. Many refugees who come from our socioeconomic backgrounds as well, and being a refugee is not a socioeconomic status. So I think there's so much work that needs to be done also around just that naming and the wording. But at every level, what is going on with Corona is going to make the situation for displaced people and migration in general extremely worse. Both from a logistics and practical perspective of how do you practice social distancing and how do you access water and sanitation, to what is this going to mean in the global resettlement and migration landscape? And that's a whole policy issue. So it's very sad.
Sarah, what about you?
So to shed some positive light on the COVID-19 situation, I think the beauty about Tables Without Borders is that we bring people around the table and we allow them to, share in the cuisine of refugees and asylees from around the world. And people have to eat. That hasn't changed as a result of COVID-19. So we've had a slight pivot as a result of all of the closures of restaurants around the DC area. And what we've been able to do is our chefs are currently going into closed restaurants in the DC area and cooking the meals they would cook for in their traditional Tables Without Borders dinners. But instead of providing those to paying diners, they're providing those meals to the most vulnerable members of our community. To date, our chefs have been able to make over 1,600 meals that we've donated to homeless shelters, medical workers, restaurant workers that have been furloughed, and essentially those that have been left by the wayside as a result of not being able to access some of the resources our government has provided during this time. And what we've found is there's an immense need for food, and there's a huge amount of food insecurity in our DC area. So Tables Without Borders has launched a GoFundMe campaign that's raised over $15,000 to essentially pay our refugee chefs and pay for the cost of food and packaging for our chefs to be employed to make meals for the community. And this is our way of giving back to the restaurant workers and the restaurant industry in small part that's really welcomed our organization and welcomed our chefs. In addition to that, COVID-19 has resulted in a lot of insecurity in terms of employment that Aaron has mentioned. And recently we've partnered with a restaurant in Washington, DC. The restaurant is Immigrant Food, and they will employ our chefs on a rotational basis to essentially create bowls that feature the meals of their home countries and the cuisine of their home countries. So in a few weeks, everyone on this call for lunch or dinner can order a bowl prepared by our refugee chefs, and a percentage of that bowl will not only go to paying the chef for their culinary, for the cuisine that they're making, but also pay for their salary that they're going to be receiving working at Immigrant Food. And this is just a way that we've been able to pivot while also providing the community with a sense of diversity and a sense of transparency about the chefs that we work with and their contribution to not only the DC area, but our society as a whole.
Thank you, Sarah. Before I ask you guys my last question, and it'll be like a quick fire one because I do want to get definitely to the audience questions. I did want to give you one more instruction. If you go down to the button called participants, and you open that, you'll see something called raise hand, and you can go ahead and click on that. If you have a question for any of our speakers, and we'll turn to those questions in a minute. You can also write them in the chat function, and we can pick them up that way and read them for you, whichever you prefer. So my last question, and again, sort of 1 minute, everyone, please. Can you just talk about maybe one thing that you've seen in your industries that gives you some hope for the future?
I'll jump in. I think, no apologies, to kind of bring the mood down at the beginning. I do think that when looking at how workers are going to protect themselves, how workers are getting access in the future to sick leave at a bare minimum, the conversations I'm hearing are not coming from a place of compassion, but they're happening. People are acknowledging that if you are going to go eat at a restaurant or you're going to be traveling and you need to stay somewhere, as a consumer, you want to be sure that the people who are working to serve you are well taken care of, that they're not coming in sick, that they have the appropriate equipment. So I think what is really positive, we'll take positivity and outcomes where we can, is that is going to start to force a change. that also gives us as consumers or some other people on these calls as more shareholders or board members or stakeholders, a lot of personal power, right? Like you can spend a little more time finding someone that is treating their staff appropriately and support their businesses. They are, you know, that's around, and that is also coming. So I do think, however this goes, people are going to start to get access to those really fundamental core components for health, because that will become a business need. So I'm very encouraged by that, and would implore you all to really be mindful that we do have more ability to help in this situation than it might seem.
Sarah, something that gives you hope?
So I think to go back to a specific example, a few days ago, we provided 500 meals to the clients of CASA, which is a nonprofit organization here in DC that mainly serves Latin American immigrants. And what we found was the line for cars coming to receive meals was a lot more than what our meals were able to provide for that day. But through the overwhelming response from the community during this time, wanting to support Tables Without Borders and our initiative, we've continued to increase our goal because people want to give back and they want to support those that are left by the wayside, like you mentioned, Kate. So something that gives me hope is that there's a desire to support individuals such as immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, to provide them to be change agents, to have an impact in their new communities. And this is just a small example of how our industry, how the restaurant industry runs in normal times, as well as how the restaurant industry is running today, and how even though restaurants are closed, you know, most of the individuals in the back that are making those takeout meals are immigrants and are individuals that are representative of the communities that our organizations serve. So we'll get through this, I think, now, and it'll only make us, I think, stronger down the line once these organizations reopen and continue to rely on, you know, the clients that we serve as organizations in the future.
Thank you, Sarah. Aileen, quickly, one thing that gives you hope.
You know, for me, the issues we're facing are systemic. There's a political crisis and a mindset crisis, and then there's also a crisis in the humanitarian sector, the way the humanitarian sector functions. There's a lack of sustainability. So I would say that there's been an overall push for smaller social enterprises to come in with innovation, and I think that gives us optimism and, you know, this openness to thinking outside of the box, outside the traditional mindset of providing support and aid. And I would say that, you know, one thing that's the most powerful we've seen in our work is these human connections that we're building. One UN staff member who takes classes with us shared with us that her relationship with her tutor every week when she meets her tutor, she goes into their home virtually, is incomparable to what she might have learned in her policy program or even working for the UN. And that these human connections are really what will help push and change systems. So when we've seen this outpour of our current students really encouraging people to sign up for our classes, we've seen students buy sessions for their parents who are home and can't leave the house. We've seen mothers bring Natakalam sessions to their children. So children who are as young as 8 and 9 getting lessons from a refugee and hearing their story, you know, starting early. These are really hopeful signs for us, and it's slow and it's gonna take a really long time. But, you know, that is exciting and that gives us hope. And of course, we're thrilled to be able to continue our work despite the current situation with.
And it's a silver lining to the crisis, a small one, but we have to take them where we can find them. Thank you for sharing that. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. Thank you so much, everyone. We'll get to Elizabeth first, but very quickly, I just want to introduce my colleague, Andrew Jacobs. Andrew, you there?
I'm here. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. It's so good to see you all. We're really grateful that we're able to maintain our community in this online manner. We cherish you all, and we're also really, really grateful for the financial support of our community. I know that many of you have already come to the rescue during this time, but for those of you who don't know, we are a 501c3 nonprofit. It means we rely entirely on donations from individuals like you all. So if and only if you're in the place to do so, we highly encourage you to consider going to halcyonhouse.org to take a gift to Halcyon. And you all are some of the first to know this big breaking news, which you'll hear tomorrow. Tomorrow we are launching a joint campaign with the Georgetown Bid. Starting tomorrow through Giving Tuesday, which is next Tuesday, it's a global day of giving for COVID relief to support small business. So all funds raised starting tomorrow through Tuesday are being split to the BID's relief program for workers in Georgetown who have been unemployed as a result of COVID-19, and for our operations to support the wonderful entrepreneurs that you're seeing today, in addition to our wonderful civic-minded artists that we support through the Arts Lab program. So if you're interested in being a part of that, look out for your emails tomorrow. Thank you so much for being here, and I will pass it back along to Kate.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I think the first question that I have seen here is from Elizabeth, and it's what is one sustainability strategy that each of you would recommend, like a next step with some long-term goals? Who wants to jump in and grab that one?
I can jump in. So, you know, so what's very interesting is very often when I pitch نتكلم, people are confused and they think that Americans are teaching English to the refugees, for example. And so I think there is, again, as I mentioned, there's a push towards thinking of sustainable approaches to providing aid and support. And so, you know, the model of نتكلم is really grounded in financial empowerment and agency given to you know, the displaced communities we support. And I think that there needs to be kind of a mindset switch and actually going back into the monetization mindset, right? You know, it's funny, people write to us and are like, are you doing free classes now because of COVID? And I'm like, the whole goal of what we're doing is to provide an income to refugees. I think the whole world has gone so much into free services, free access to the news, but then how do journalists make money? Free access to this, free access to that. And we're destroying actually the job market with automation and things like that. So, you know, I think that there needs to be even like beyond the refugee immigration focus, like I think our global system right now needs to kind of think a bit, again, what does this do when we're so used to everything being free? And so our approach really has been, we're not going to do virtual exchange where one refugee talks to another and they exchange languages. Like, we are very clear that we are charging this because our goal is to bring job opportunities and income opportunities back. And sometimes I have to really insist on that because people are like, oh, well, you know, people sometimes think we do free services for some reason because they affiliate the NGO world and the refugee world with that. So that's just one kind of thought on that.
Well, I imagine you have great retention, right? Because people value stuff that they pay for, and there is a really smart, that's really smart of you. Erin, we've got a question specifically for you here. Are you hearing from the workers that you work with that there is a language barrier when it comes to them filing for unemployment or other resources that might be available to them right now?
The majority of our work thus far has been with Spanish speakers who are learning English. And I think very fortunately, most of those resources are available in Spanish. So for me particularly, no, I have not seen it. But yes, that is a huge barrier for sure.
We do have time for one more question. If there's one out there, please raise your hand. Otherwise, Aileen or Erin or Sarah, do you have a question for each other or a thought for each other, perhaps?
Yeah, I guess, you know, I think one of the themes that I've taken away from this is that, you know, how language and food and everything really can humanize interactions and really reduce those barriers of me and the other, per se, with that mentality. So I guess something that we're working on now is looking at how to really shape that conversation, and how to help people recognize limitations and what's viewed as generosity versus good business practice. And I guess my question to either of you is, you know, how do you see us shaping that conversation moving forward? Because I think we all have a lot of insights, and I think it's a conversation that needs to be had.
I think from our perspective for Tables Without Borders, through food, we've been able to allow the refugees and the asylum seekers that we work with to be placed in a restaurant and kind of be provided the space to be on the same playing field, essentially, as these top tier chefs. And our diners are coming out and not ordering the food because they quote unquote feel bad for the refugee chef, but the food is up to par with what they're getting at Michelin star restaurants. And the only difference between the Michelin star restaurant and what our chefs are providing is access. And by providing the simple access to our chefs to cooking these establishments is essentially opening them up to an industry that is a lot bigger than what they are known to work for, and essentially taking them out of just cooking for their own to cooking for everyone. And once you provide individuals with opportunities to use their skills to execute for the masses as opposed to just for their own individual communities, it opens others up to the opportunity to engage with you know, a diverse group of people they wouldn't otherwise engage with. And I think that's why Halcyon is so important, because it values social impact and it supports social enterprises in a way that shows people that you can have a social impact and do good while providing a good service. And that's what really sets kind of our organizations, I think, apart from others, and what really is going to continue to drive change.
Aileen, any last words?
So much to say around this, but I'll try and be wrap it up. I just want to say, like Erin and Sarah, hang in there. I think social entrepreneurship is a very complex field and very young. And too often we are placed against the startup sector, which has a total different goal. And I think that it's very hard as social entrepreneurs to go through startup competitions where we're expected X amount of return in X amount of time. And I've done a lot of reading about this, and I attended a couple of courses recently, and you know, patience and acceptance that our impact might be slower at the beginning, you know, and being in this kind of constant, you know, tension between our impact and our sustainability and eventually profitabilities for those who choose to be a for-profit. I think it's just an ongoing struggle. And, you know, I think that us as social entrepreneurs, we have to make peace with that, because we're really, we're put on under a lot of pressure because we really care about the impact we're doing, but then we also need to you know, live up to the standard, to the quality, to the profitability, et cetera. And I think, you know, I'd just say, you know, it's, you know, I think we're all in this, and of course, language and culture and food are great moments over which we can connect and bond. But I think, but I do think it's great to have a revenue model, and I think it's still a very new thing. And yeah, I think, I don't know, my thoughts, I have so much to say around this, but I guess.
I know, and we could totally talk probably until 10 o'clock, but I so appreciate you dropping that in, Arlene. It's something, obviously, that we see so often at Halcyon, and that desire to have profit and impact and a virtuous cycle around them. But you know, if you're aiming to achieve profit and impact, you know, you're basically working twice as hard, and I appreciate you shedding a light on that and the nuances there. But that about wraps us up for today. I really want to thank each of you, Sarah, Erin, and Eileen, for joining us. I know you have a lot on your plates and on your minds, and I really appreciate you all taking the time. I also want to thank everyone here for joining the 5th Breakfast with Halcyon event. We are back at the same time next week talking with fellows whose work relates to education in the classroom. This Friday, we also have a virtual studio visit with Monochrome Collective's Nina O'Neill and DC and LA-based photographer Kate Warren chatting about tips on how to photograph and present your artwork, all from home. And when we follow up, we'll send a link to sign up for both of those events and for you to see our now new full May events calendar. We are going to close this out, but we'll leave the Zoom conference open for another few minutes in case people want to chat and wrap up on your own time. And a staff member will let you know when we're preparing to close the meeting. Thank you again to our speakers and all of you, and we look forward to seeing you next week.